and I'm so glad that you were able to make it. I hope the lunch is good. I don't know about you, but it helps to come to meetings when they're going to feed me, and so I'm glad that you were able to make it. I'm very sorry President Snyder won't be able to join us today. There was a family matter she had to attend to, but Dr. Musil and I agree that the next time President Snyder is in D.C., she has a trip to make. She has a stop to make in D.C. When I first told President Snyder that we were going to create this opportunity, she said, "Oh, I want to meet her." So we were scheduled for that to happen at 11:30. It didn't happen, but I want you to know that your presence here means a great deal. We just had an opportunity for our guests to meet with Provost Bazelak, and some of the discussion we're going to have today, I think, is important for the kind of work we need to do here at the university. I want you to know how we're situating today's conversation. You know, I've been here since, I just had a 2-year anniversary, I think it is, and so I've been here since 2009. I came as the inaugural vice president to begin some conversations around how we do diversity here. I always believed that I was building on issues of diversity and inclusion that were already in place. There's been good work here. Some of you already know about the ACES Advance Grant. Some of you may know now about the IDEAL Grant. So there's been good work that's been happening here as it relates to diversity and inclusion, but we needed to take our work up to another notch. We have issues. Some of you have heard Faculty Senate reports. We just did a report for the Board of Trustees that say, despite some of our best efforts, we haven't made all the progress we need to make. So we are attempting to address that. In my office, we've had some foundational work of developing a diversity leadership council. Many members of that council are here. I've been working with the Faculty Senate Committee on Women, the Faculty Senate Committee on Minorities, the PACM, which is President's Advisory Council on Minorities, PACAO, President's Advisory Council on Women, the Supplier Diversity Initiative Council. There are representatives from all those committees here today. So I just want to thank you for saying yes to the invitation and for being present. Members of the President's Cabinet and members of the President's Council are also present. So I thank you for being present. So in the Office of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity, in addition to this foundational work, you know, last semester we had our Power of Diversity series. Each item that we are doing, we're trying not to simply do add-ons. We're trying to, as I understood my position, transform the culture. We're trying to do institutional change. It's incremental. It takes time. It takes all of you. One of the initiatives out of our office is one called Train the Champion. Some of the Train the Champion cohort, the first cohort of Train the Champion, they're going to be together for about 6 months. They began last Tuesday of learning about diversity across the board in all of its different forms. That's already started out of our office. So I just want to thank all of you who I've interacted with in any way, shape, or form, because no one person can do this work. Sometimes people act like, okay, we got a chief diversity officer, it's her job. We know that the real institutional change happens when different pockets of energy are working. And so I just appreciate you all so much for what you're contributing to our efforts. Today, we are attempting to have a discussion to move the bar a little bit more. I want to say we're launching the Diversity Strategic Action Planning process with this discussion. The Diversity Leadership Council has already had phases of this conversation, but I've always known when I became Chief Diversity Officer that at some point, to align with the diversity initiatives that are outlined in our strategic plan forward thinking, we knew we would have to have a university-wide diversity strategic action plan. I've put action in it because you know the vision statement for our office is promoting diversity with inclusive thinking, mindful learning, and transformative dialogue. Some people say, oh, so that means you're just going to talk. No, we're not just going to talk. There's going to be action. And so today we've invited a very special guest, Dr. Caryn McTighe Musil, to help us launch this new phase of our diversity and inclusive work here at the university. As I said, it's been a core value of the university strategic plan. The deans and many of the offices have worked with me and talked about their initiatives. And so I believe today, as we begin this more intentional way of developing this plan, and we are members of the Diversity Leadership Council have already been working behind the scenes to first look at, see what our peer institutions are doing. We have 2 consultants we're considering who, one of whom will be chosen maybe by next week. I don't want to say, but we believe by next week. And so today's guest is going to help us think about this from her perspective. Many of you have heard me talk about both and thinking, and I mean that to mean that diversity work and the drive toward inclusive excellence is both looking at the domestic scene, what we do here in the United States, and looking at how diversity shows up overseas, how it shows up in other places. As David Fleshler ramps up our efforts in international affairs, we're always going to be talking about these 2 together. Domestic or national or local diversity, and, so there's a giant and in that sentence, global diversity. There are some initiatives that are already happening that address that. Our guest has been doing that from a national perspective for some years. So I'll introduce her now. Dr. Caryn McTighe Musil is the Senior Vice President at the Association of American Colleges and Universities and oversees the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Global Initiatives. Under her leadership, the office has been working to mobilize powerful and overlapping educational reform movements involving civic, diversity, global learning, women's issues, and personal and social responsibility. This bio is long and it says a lot of good stuff, but I just want to do a couple highlights. She's currently directing a multi-project national initiative, Core Commitments Educating Students for Personal and Social Responsibility. And I think that's important because we know we have a Center for Civic Engagement and Service Learning, and AAC&U has been at the forefront of what does civic engagement mean. In addition to experiential learning, what does it mean for our curriculum? And here, as we look at SAGES, we just had a chance to talk to Peter Whiting, as we look at SAGES and as the Faculty Senate talks about issues related to the core curriculum, some of the work that's been happening at AAC&U around general education is also significant. Dr. Musil, with her colleagues Kevin Hovland, also directs a FIPSI-funded project, Shared Future, Gen Ed for Shared Learning. In addition, she serves as director of the Program of the Status and Education of Women. This is really how Dr. Musil and I met. We met in the DC area as English professors who were interested in women's studies and who had we kept showing up around the Beltway at some of the same meetings in women's studies, and so it's just a pleasure to have you here for that reason. Dr. Musil is also co-directing a Department of Education project on how to make civic learning and democratic engagement more of a priority in higher education. Did I read that correctly? I wanted to get that in as well. So because of her work, because of her engagement with universities and colleges all around the country, I think we have a wonderful thinker here today who can think with us as we think about these issues of inclusive excellence. So please help me welcome our guest, Dr. Caryn McTighe Musil.
I'm sure that those of you who have worked with Dr. Mobley understand what a treasure you have brought to your own campus, brought back to your own campus, I would say, and the kind of energy and vision and deep commitment that she brings to her work. I want to thank her for bringing me here, and I learn an enormous amount when I go to campuses. I sit in a building in Washington. I was a faculty member for 16 years, so I've been sitting where many of you are, working with student affairs, working on promotion and tenure committees, working on student development issues. But for the last 20 years or more, I've been in national offices, and at AAC&U, we find that our best advice to campuses come from those of you sitting on campuses. We don't sit there and invent things. We listen carefully to you, and I've already come back and learned so much about the strategies you are using. And I also want to say that, and I say this from the bottom of my heart, it's wonderful to be in Cleveland. I know not everybody says that. And even in January, though I do feel particularly blessed at the temperature. When I went out this morning, I couldn't believe that it was as warm as it was. I have a picture actually on my wall, because you'll discover a sister of mine has migrated here from Allegheny College. She came here to teach and fell in love with a man, with the lake, and with the city, and has been here ever since. So I come here with a lot of regularity to Cleveland. I don't always choose January as the month. There is a famous family story where my sister lives close to the lake, and she said, "Oh, let's go look at the lake." Well, I mean, it was one of those typical January days. You know, you get around the last building by the lake, and the wind is coming at you, and you can, I mean, you're just freezing, and she's Cleveland, you know, so she's just strutting out there in front of the lake, feeling fine. So that is sort of my marker for probably from March until November. Is when I, you know, to choose to travel, though it has been beautiful. We ate at a place on Saturday. I came in then and they took us out to a brunch that was right on the lake. It's just gorgeous in winter and elsewhere. I also had a chance to sort of snoop around your neighborhood because I went to the Cleveland Art Museum. That's where my sister took me on Saturday, so I got to see the very exciting new wings there and to go back to a museum that when I was an undergraduate was the first place I'd ever seen a Monet painting, and it was the Monet Lilies, which has you know, made me adore Monet ever since, and taught me in the way that just being really ignorant and looking at something can open you to a whole new world of things. And that is really what diversity is all about. It is stimulating some of that curiosity, some of that eagerness to see the way other people see the world, and to begin to be able to step behind and see that. This has been a busy week for you. When I looked at what was happening this week around Martin Luther King's recognition of his life and the way in which he focused the attention of our nation in important ways, and wanted us to achieve a kind of beloved community that we are still seeking for. He was thinking beyond the possible, which is one of the phrases that I think you all use, and I don't know whether it's Maryland's office or Case Western itself. Case Western. So thinking beyond the possible is really what this is all about, because I was commenting to Marilyn that I loved the title for your week, The Weight of History and the Challenge of Change. And the weight of history and this work is not being done in a vacuum. It is being done against a long history of creating universities without most of us in this room being in mind or having access to it for most of its history. And I come out of women's studies, and so I'm in literature, so I read texts as I come into buildings. And of course, the beautiful building that you're in that is called Adelbert Hall, you know, it reflects its history in the wonderful oil painting, the exquisite oil paintings that are overwhelmingly telling me about the history of Case and of Western Reserve and of power and who had it and who shaped it. So they are all male, they are all white, they all seem as if they, you know, were comfortable, but one doesn't really know that from a painting. So there is a certain weight of history in which you say, we want to honor so much that is the foundation that made this university great, that established things, but that isn't all there is, just as if that isn't all there is to the canon of knowledge. It isn't all there is to who we need, whose voices we need, whose leadership we need. And as our nation as a whole will become, I think, majority, what we now call minority, in 2050, we really have to invest, if we care about our nation's future, in all of our futures, and not doing things the way we always did them, because those really, not always consciously, but and sometimes very consciously, had the impact of educating the few rather than the many. So I'm going to talk today about what higher education can do, especially in the 21st century, in the big enterprise that's before us. I'll look a little bit, there's three small parts, sort of what have we done, especially in the last 50 years. What are our front burner issues now? And I tried to think a little bit about what some of the key things are that I've seen in your issues at Case Western. And what can we do? What are some directions we can take? And I will begin with a story of mine that was actually true, and it inspired the title of my talk, Discovering the Streets Where We Lived. And it involves a very long but a fascinating ride I took down a major street in another wonderful lakeside city in Chicago. So I drove down a street that began, it was called Devon. I don't know whether they call it Devon, but it's Devon Avenue in Chicago. And I began at Chicago International Airport, where I'd been invited to spend a few days at Loyola University, which is right on Lake Michigan in the downtown heart. It is itself a Jesuit university. That's its sort of diversity niche in our wonderful diversity panoply of kinds of institutions we have. And it itself had just recently absorbed one of the last women's colleges in the state. So it too was in the midst of a transformation of its own. It wasn't going to be the same Loyola University that it had been before, nor were the women and the faculty who were absorbed into that university and the students they had to reorient themselves to a very different set of possibilities they now had. So let me describe what it was like as I drove down this American street. The taxi driver took me down Devon Avenue, which is this major east-west thoroughfare, as I said, and it stretches all the way from the airport to Lake Michigan. And it's a street that was originally named Church Street when the English immigrants arrived. But then when they were, many of the ones who came in the 1850s were from Devonshire, England. So they renamed Church Street Devon Street. And the tradition of renaming has stuck with that street. In an African American section, the small brown street sign under the standard green one read Martin Luther King Boulevard. You've got one right outside your doorstep. And then as we came into a Jewish neighborhood, the street's alternate name mutated into Golda Meir Way, where the Friends of Refugees of Eastern Europe is also located, along with the Tel Aviv Bakery. Soon the colors of the shops got brighter as we drove along the Indian section of what was now called Mahatma Gandhi Street, followed shortly after by Muhammad al-Jinnah Street, where the Pakistani section was, and that was nestled next to the Bangladesh section of Devon, which had a street named Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and I don't know that man's name, so that was a new person I had to look up when I got to my destination. And in the midst of all the new communities that were carried on long after the English named Church Street Devon Street, Bryn Mawr Country Club, which is a Welsh name, I was born in Bryn Mawr Hospital outside of Philadelphia, is still on Devon, along with an Irish bar and a Korean restaurant. This is one street. And I'm not done yet. My taxi then drove me past the Rainbow Daycare Center, filled with children, that was not too far from Planned Parenthood, which was just between it and my destination, Loyola College, a Catholic institution that has particular views toward reproduction. This was on one single street. This is the streets where we live. It is the street where many of our students come from. And when we think about global, and we'll probably say a few things about global during the course of this, the world is here. We don't have to leave the United States to be in contact with people who weren't born here. And that is particularly true in this last 20 years where, and I forget, among Asian Americans, something like 2/3 of Asian Americans weren't born in this country. And that has to do, of course, with policies behind that excluded Asian Americans. It was actually called the Asian American Exclusion Act. We were very clear about what we were doing. So and this was, began in an early period and continued and wasn't altered until 1965 and with the new immigration laws. So we are really surrounded by a world and a culture that has interacted with the world and right now has this flow of immigrants that parallel the flow in our media, the flow in our goods, the integration of our finances. We can't do anything. Our weather, there is a volcano in, erupting in, and I forget, Iceland it was, that shuts down all of Europe, that then keeps Kenyan flower producers from being able to deliver their flowers to the markets. So, we are not in these separate entities. We are really touching corners and living on each other's streets. And our job as educators is to tell students how to navigate these streets. They are going to be more and more common everywhere. They're going to be in their workplaces. They're going to be, though a certain amount of economic stratification allows us to sort, continues to sort. The president of UVA, John Castine, the former president, used to say, if you tell me what zip code that baby is from, that I'm looking at the maternity ward, I can tell you what their chances of going to college is. So we do have that stratification, but we are really mixing our cultures, our faith traditions, our histories in ways that it makes it one of the most exciting moments to be to be in the U.S. One of the things we want to ask is, for what kind of world are we educating students? For what ultimate purposes? I love that one of the key things that comes out again and again in your literature is that you are about improving people's lives. This isn't simply about, and one of the issues with the Civic Project is how there is a tension, some of it's a generative tension, between ways in which higher education is and has been understood to be a private good in which you are gaining new skills, new knowledge, new credentials, new social and economic mobility. But it is ultimately a public good as well. We were created in the first place to contribute to an emerging new nation, and at different points to different things that were needed along our history. So we keep those two together, and what you have done with those kinds of remembrances, that part of what the purposes you want for your students' knowledge is that they will apply it in ways that improve things for the larger good. It's wonderful to be doing and standing in front of this, since one of the things we've been working on is how to make that more visible. It's one that everybody agrees to, but usually assigns to someone else to do. That is, to educate for personal and social responsibility. And then I think in this preparing students is, what are some of the stiff challenges in terms of helping them see, analyze, understand, and have some strategies for changing the structural inequalities that are the things that keep the inequalities in place. And sometimes you have to go behind the thing itself. They're usually more invisible. A very powerful book by Paul Farmer, who is a wonderful doctor who's done a lot of his work in Haiti, called The Pathologies of Power. And he really talks about these structural inequities that mean the poorest of the poor will have the worst health care, the least access to food, the most illiterate. And it's not because it's about them. It's about how their world, their lives, their gender, their race, the country they're from, their place in that country is structured. And how to learn to see those systems is really a critical thing that I think students need for the 21st century, because it is more intertwined than ever. So understanding how those often hidden structures work will be really important. So let me just say I will begin by with a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, because I want to move through the three parts. The first, focusing on education, which is the most treasured of civil rights, and I'll talk a little bit in this first section about how we're making education available, the trends in the ways institutions have been at the forefront of really taking this seriously, higher education institutions, and what some 21st century coordinates are that we can look toward, and that I think you're trying to do here at Case Western. Then I'm going to focus on one or two or three troublesome issues, disparities that continue to be perplexing and resistant to change, and see whether we might think about that a little bit. And then to talk a little bit finally about how to engage, create inclusive environments, and close not the, I learned this from someone working, I made a reference to, it was a community-based center at Otterbein, actually in Ohio, and I referred to at-risk kids, and she said, well, we like to call them at promise, which was a very nice way to sort of say that is what we want for every child, and that is a piece of what we want for every student who walks into Case Western. How do we make sure that the student who comes in here freshman year has every possibility to flourish and to be their full talent, their full resources drawn from who they've come from, who's helped shape them, the values that they have from their communities, and all that they will gain from being here for 4 years, and in some cases for a little bit more. All that you are adding to that experience. This is a W.E.B. Du Bois quote, and of course I tend to think of him, of course, as being one of the great analyzers of race and helping this country understand how race as a system was deeply embedded in everything we did in our country. And when I came across this quote, and I came across it because Heather Wathington shared it with me and always had it at the bottom of her email. And the right to learn is the most fundamental. I think one of the things we can take great pride in is what the 20th century meant in higher education. Though we focus a lot on our problems right now, my father was born in 1902 in Pittsburgh, and by 1996, when his grandchildren were in college, the transformation of higher education was beyond what is possible to think about. When he was born, 3% of Americans went to college. By the time his granddaughters went, at the end of that same century, 75% of students who graduate from high school went on to some kind of college. They didn't all graduate. We're losing the 25% who don't graduate from high school. Those are all important things to look at. But that is an amazing triumph. It's probably one of the most important contributions to democracy, to our whole nation's future, that we as a higher education sector were part of transforming what is possible for students' futures, for their ability to contribute to knowledge, to solving problems, to contributing innovative ideas, and to making their communities stronger and better. And that didn't happen because time passed. That happened because people worked hard at it, the same way many of you are working in this institution to be sure that Case Western does all it needs to do and all it can do to play its part in this important next moment. I'm going to quickly name a couple of the sort of approaches to diversity that characterize particularly the last half of the 20th century. And as you know, the real big movement of transformation in higher education really occurred after World War II. First began with the GI Bill. You're bringing huge numbers of first-generation students. You're bringing huge numbers of veterans who are older. That was and the debates then were so fascinating because people said you're going to ruin the quality. We can't achieve excellence if you do this. I mean, there's a lot of resistance to something we take for granted now. But the work around race and gender in particular, and around religious opportunities, because my Jewish friends who were at Smith, she said, well, I was one of 3. They might not have put the quota out, but they really weren't going to have more than 3 Jewish women at that school at that time. So we really began to try, and we ended what was an apartheid system here. In the 60s, something like, most of our institutions that existed were 95 to 6 to 7% one race or another. In most of our cases, that was either white or African American. But it was essentially a segregated system, much like South Africa is trying to undo and reformulate. They had 4 systems there for their 4 color groups. So we began, by first chronologically sort of beginning with access and then moving to special programs and then worrying about campus climate and culture and policies. And we didn't always do these in this order. Sometimes the disciplinary, I mean, those of us in women's studies, we're working on the discipline, and then that gets us into the climate, which then gets us into diversity as a compelling institutional and educational priority. This is actually where we're beginning from in a curious way, while we're also still going back and trying to address those other things. And one of the things about being far enough along is you then realize you're far enough to see what you aren't doing. So we're paying much more attention to the students that aren't graduating from high school, that we're losing along the way. And there is enormous reinvestment by higher education and others, but higher education can and must and is play a major role in solving the disastrous school system we have, which is based on, in most states, on income. So my children in a nice suburb of Washington, they have everything they could possibly want. And 8 blocks from where I work in downtown DC in Shaw, it's a different story. It's a different story, and it's a different set of possibilities. Jonathan Kozol calls them savage inequalities. So that is going to affect all that access. But we can do something about it, and there are some very exciting things that are being done as we go along. You can read this better than I can. I would only, you know, you have Marilyn here, because this is now, we said we really need to shift the structure. It's too big. We have to create structures so it doesn't depend on one person, that if one person leaves or a set of energetic souls, that you've got new structures. And what happened in the last part of the 60s was the, last part of the 90s, where all the pockets of those of you who are doing so much, you had so much going on that it wasn't coordinated. And so people really wanted to bring it together to see the whole. We began looking at the thing that most characterized our country, which was its racial segregation, its racial stratification that has defined us from our beginning. And then beginning to look at the ways in which race, one isn't just a member, one isn't just African American, one is an African American woman, one isn't just an African American woman from middle class background who was raised Baptist or perhaps Episcopalian, who might have a gay brother. I mean, it's just, it is that we had to sort it all, and we had to spend a lot of time being sure we understood the categories before we could integrate them. But I think we've got that foundation now, that intellectual and knowledge base that helps us look at the complexities across these. And now that we're moving to the world, we're seeing that those things change when you move. They change when you come here. That there are different stratifications, there are different categories, there are stratifications everywhere, and that's a piece of what I hope you'll help all your students who go abroad understand. I just put up a couple of these just because I wanted to say how global studies has evolved. And as you begin to have more activities focused on what students also need to know, that these aren't oppositional. These are parallel and integrated. And they are actually, one can't do the other, one can't proceed forward with integrity without the other. My colleague Kevin Hovland has a phrase, diversity is everyone and global is everywhere. So it is the world, we are in the world, we are part of the globe, even sitting here in the United States. So one of the important things students have to think about, what does it mean to be an American in a global, interdependent, and full of inequalities across those differences. But the differences might be north-south more than race, although you can hardly go into a country where there's some way in which race might be a major thing, but in some that isn't the defining factor. So you know, you can see those of you who've been working on diversity for some time, that these are familiar phrases to us. Us and them to we. I mean, that is the trajectory we needed to go as we worked around our different identities. And I know that you're going to be debating what to do with your diversity and your global requirement. You'll need to think afresh about that. And everybody is, so join the groups and talk to people who are and see what makes sense where you are, because you don't want, you want them to be complementary, but you want them to also not be the only place. We spent a lot of time at AAC&U helping campuses create diversity requirements in the 90s, saying all the time, you can't assume because you've got this that's all the students need to know. And in fact, as people began to assess the impact, it was really after the second and third course that addressed diversity issues that you began to finally see both the attitudinal and the behavioral shifts in students. You have to, it's like thinking, I took freshman comp, I don't need to write anymore. You know, we would never assume that. So how do you have people revisit things as they have more to visit? And of course, you know, takes us to Pat Hill Collins and subjugated knowledge and the way in which we are situated. We know what we know from a particular location, and we need each other to see the whole. So she will argue that it creates an epistemology of dialogue. You really have to talk across what you don't know in order to get a big more of the whole. And so I think as we enter the 21st century, and this seems to be where you are, we're not trying to fix the new students. We're trying to be sure we have an institution that's designed so they'll flourish. And that takes some structural changes, it takes some practice changes, it takes some rethinking of how you do things, a resource allocation. One of the more recent analysis by Jane Wellman in terms of student support systems is that when you don't have to increase money in order to have greater success with students who are not prepared by their institution to necessarily flourish. If you direct your money in strategic ways in student support systems, it has an overwhelmingly positive effect and impact toward that goal. You know, so it's how you embrace anybody who's learning something new. My daughter took microeconomics. It was tough. She struggled with it. I'm saying, Rebecca, I'm paying a lot of money for your tuition. Go talk to the professor. Go find whether they have peer tutoring in economics. I'm telling her to take advantage of what's there to guarantee her success. That's what we should all be doing. And it's financially in our interest. Okay. I'm going to point now to a couple, and I'm only going to maybe talk for 7 or so minutes, so I'm going to, so you can raise some questions. Despite all of this wonderful work, huge transformations in a half a century, we still have a bachelor degree attainment by race, and this is of the 25 to 29-year-olds. That's deeply disturbing and problematic. So when you look at it, you want to say, we better fix this. This little group down here has the lowest of bachelor degree, they're going to be our new 40%, I think, are going to be Latinas in 2050. It is the growing new, and I just saw a report from California. I think it's already 50%. And they're not any better off in California, and they're saying this is our economic future. We cannot survive as a state if we aren't educating the majority of our population. My institution, LaSalle, went co-ed in part because it was the good thing to do, but also in part because they'd run out of Catholic boys. It was economically their viability. So institutions that aren't really thinking these are our new students, we better be ready for them, and we better be working because they're also our new faculty. This is the next generation of faculty. So how do we invest and how do we correct some of these and alter some of this? If you look by income, this is even, frankly, a greater disparity. That the top quartile income, 75% of those will have a degree. The bottom, less than 9%. Permanent poverty if you don't have a college degree. And we know already, if you follow the data on SATs, they're correlated. The scores are correlated to income. So whether you're measuring what a student knows or what an income allows you to have in terms of educational resources and riches, you know, that may be what the SAT measures more than aptitude. And we know also that it correlates more clearly with your first year and not after that. It has very little to do with anything. So this is a huge issue. And the economic inequality is one of those more invisible things, especially because we all just want to have what everybody else has. That's what we see. That's what we want. We are going through a period of the greatest economic gap that we've gone through since the Gilded Age. And that's not usually good for a country's long-term health. And there are things to think about. They are tough. They are unpopular. But there we are in a world that is promising a future like that. Now if we move to faculty, you can see, and I know this is an issue you're wrestling with, just like you're wrestling with diversity of students. And at least in the last presentation I saw, there was a kind of largely flatlining, either in terms of increases in students across racial groups, and I don't know, you probably have some, I don't think I saw those, but some around first-generation students. I don't know whether those are increasing or not. But you also are flatlining in terms of efforts to diversify your faculty by race and also by white women, particularly in the sciences. And for underrepresented minorities, you know, that in 2006, now this excludes, as most of you know, Asian Americans. Otherwise, you'd have a third, about a third of the nation are not white. And so look at the distinctions. And I think I want to say 6%, but I might be wrong on that, which is lower although you're always lower at research institutions than other kinds, but I think it's lower than you could be and that you should be and that your peers are. And then the underrepresented minorities receiving more PhDs, but getting proportionally fewer of the new positions. Even though most of us will say, we're not hiring because they're so competitive, and we can't compete to get X or Y or Z. Well, that may not be the case. And this is something that Daryl Smith and a group of people doing some work in California with the Irvine Project, that this is one of those places where you'd think we would be flying up, and we're not. So it's going to take a hard look to figure out all the reasons why, some of which might be specific to an area, an institution, disciplines. You know, you've got an engineering school, but you've got nursing alongside that. So, you know, it seems like that some of this you might be able to remedy, if not across all, certainly by compensating across them, sort of like carbon credits. And then the other thing that Daryl and her colleagues discovered was that there was a kind of revolving door. People said, oh, we've hired here, we've hired there, we've hired there, but when they looked at the whole, they weren't retaining the faculty. So just like the students, the whole point, the whole economic investment for an institution is graduating them. It costs money to not graduate students. You might not know that, but it costs money not to graduate students. So this is what they found in California. So you need to think, you know, about retention as well as recruitment, and that's true for students. And we know about both of them. So these are two ones in which there are a lot of people working hard. There's lots of peers you can find who might be able to work with you and help you see what worked for them. A friend of mine, chair of an English department, small college, hired 3 faculty of color the same year. And she wrote about it in the Chronicle. And she said, well, I knew that it'd be hard to just come one at a time, and we had 3 openings, and there were these 3 fantastic people that were in the areas we really wanted, and I just kept calling them. I went after them. I didn't wait for them to come to me. And one of them said, she clearly wanted me. They understood that she valued her credentials, her potential, and that there'd be this inviting chair. So there are ways in which you can do both at the same time. We also know, just like the students, you get some of these positive things from faculty of color. Robert Abaro has done some work on across, that's actually in the next slide. I'll just put this. It was actually Robert Abaro where I first saw the teaching, the more student-centered teaching. Women as a whole do more student-centered teaching, and men of color, except for Asian American men, also do more student-centered teaching as a group. These are all as a group. But so if you're really changing your curriculum, you want more engaged students, you care what the NESE reports, you want to bring faculty who bring those assets to the job and the evidence of that as well. I'm gonna sort of, I think, only to say to this, that this is the sort of what students are going through while they're there. Some key things that they actually will think about while they're here. And they'll begin with the first one. And often your first seminars, they're figuring out, who am I now that I'm not at home? Who am I now that I am at the threshold of adulthood? Who am I now that I'm choosing my, debating my faith commitments? Who am I as I'm trying to figure out what it means to live justly in the world? These are all kinds of knowledges that I first created as a diversity literacy shorthand, and then began doing global. I thought, well, it kind of works for global. And then I'm doing a lot of work with civic. And of course, it's a piece of, if you're going to create communities, strong communities across differences, you're going to also do this as well. Okay. I'm going to speed through these only because to say that there's new spaces for learning at the intersection. I think your forward-thinking strategies are very exciting. The big four interdisciplinary things, energy and the environment, health, culture, creativity, and design, and the last one was social justice and ethics. They're wonderful, and all of us have something to say, whatever our discipline, about those four. You may say, well, I'd rather have one that's a little bit more, you can have that debate about whether there should be a fifth or a sixth, but there's lots of spaces where you can put these big questions that require the kind of knowledge that we have I'm now shifting to the knowledge base of diversity, and I'll just let these stay up here. And I think that this is another new arena, and I don't know enough about what you're doing in the city, but I know that you have a Center for Community Engagement. People like Nancy Cantor at Syracuse University, another fine private research university, has created a whole huge, ambitious initiative in partnership with states and business and local community groups to revitalize the downtown part of Syracuse in housing, in schooling, in business, and using the skills of all of the academic disciplines in order to do that. So that students are down there, creating sustainable housing that is affordable, that moves into a traditional environment, and instead of, in my area, they just build a house twice as big as what the one I'm in next to me, that costs twice as much. It is probably not sustainable, and that's called new housing. This was kind of how do we build housing so it's sustainable and I bring my best design. And so there are wonderful collaborations across the boundaries, and then collaborations between student and academic affairs, which gives us the holistic work that we need. I'll just say this, that engagement is the key. It isn't just, because one of the things you have to think about is, are we just having diversity to have diversity? It's a means to an end. It's a means to an intellectual end. It's a means to a societal end. It's a means to a more holistic development. And we have lots of research that says, and Pat Guerin from Michigan often said, we have to think about it as a library. It's one thing to have 5 million books in the library. It's another thing if they don't read them. So just having them there, it's how you structure in your curriculum, in your corporate life, in your community life, the engagement. And there's just tons of evidence on that And I'll leave this available to Marilyn to use if you want to have access to it. That is a benefit to individuals, it's a benefit to institutions. So there's just lots of ways in which diversifying your institution and structuring that diversity in positive ways is just a win-win for everyone. This is kind of interesting, came out in the Washington Post a few years ago. I liked that second one in particular. You know, when there were minorities present, the entire group shifted their thinking. The entire group. So if you're talking about social entrepreneurship and how you think about innovation for the imagining what doesn't seem to be possible, diversity is one of the keys for that as well. This is important because students need to feel, they're watching carefully what the institution as a whole has to say about all of this. So sometimes you know, just having the change is not necessarily, when it's not well done, just like you know, certain kinds of engagements across differences, when they're not well structured, drive people back into their sort of prejudices. You already use a lot of these high impact practices. I was talking to Peter about your gen ed. In your learning communities, your writing intensive, we know that certain focused kinds of engagements, of practices really can accelerate student learning. And we also know that certain things will enrich that. That is the level of the challenge of those, the faculty interaction, the kind of supportive campus environment. These are hard to read, and I'm sorry, but I wanted to just do those because it fits to one of the issues you're dealing with, which is the success and thriving of new students who may be underprepared. This shows the practices used in the first this is from George Kuh's work, key to their ACT scores. So the ACT score is this green line at the bottom. What you see is that when you get these really strong high impact practices, it starts to close the gap. It starts to close the achievement gap. And there's some of these, I don't know whether I've got one of these up here, that actually the students, African Americans, are returning in greater numbers than the white students because of purposeful practices, that is high impact practices, ones you've thought about. So they're not just good for learning, they keep people succeeding and they help shift the inequities that you start with. Now, what I'd be wanting to know is, are we not reaching those white students? What we want is everybody to go way up. But what you found was this accelerated thing. And then I think I might just end with these three questions, which are from a very important mentor in my life, Edgar Beckham. I don't know if any of you knew him at the Ford Foundation. He was one of the first African-American students at Wesleyan. He then became a faculty member there. He became a dean of the faculty. He became a Ford Foundation program officer. And when he retired from Ford, he actually spent about 5 years as a senior fellow with us. So I got to travel with him a lot. But in the 90s, he was visiting colleges. He helped stimulate so much of the work that's going on. Whatever your aspirations, that first question is critical. What are you doing with the diversity you have? It's a great place to begin. It's a great place to be sure that what you're doing is building on the potential of all of those assets, all of those benefits, all of those opportunities to make higher education be a place where people achieve beyond their own dreams. And that's part of what we're supposed to do. See worlds they've never seen, make them think they can shape it, and then how well are all those students achieving? And that you may track that. This is something that people are increasingly tracking. So you can find out, is there a gateway course? Is there a particular department? Is there particular people? Is there something about my teaching that I'd want to know? That I'm not reaching certain students? How do I, that's one of my commitments as students. And how are you using the diversity you do have to benefit everyone? Because that is what it's all about. It is finally about helping all of us be our full selves, all of us learn more than we knew when we came in here, and all of us more willing when we drive down a street like Devon, not to lock the doors, not to roll the windows up, but to stop, get out, meet people, interact, do things together, find out what we need together that will make our communities stronger, better, fairer, more just. It's a world about improving people's lives. You're committed to it here at Case Western. You've got some challenges ahead of you, but it's why you're here. And I wish you all the best in tackling that problem with the creativity and the commitment to each other and to the students that are your reason probably for being here in the first place, as well as your commitment to knowledge, which got most of us thinking education can make a difference. It is, as Du Bois said, the greatest right of all is the right to learn. And we can learn more how to change our lives, how to change our institutions, and how to make a different world that we think right now might not be possible, but actually is. Thank you. Personally, I did want to also say I did bring some copies of our latest version of Diversity and Democracy, which is a journal that grew, it's a tri-quarterly now, that grew out of our diversity work. It was originally called Diversity Digest. It's now called Diversity and Democracy, Civic Learning for Shared Futures. And it is built around good campus practice. This particular one is called Investing in Education and Equity, Our Nation's Best Future, with a lead article by Michelle Asha Cooper, who is the new I guess, president of the Institute for Higher Education Policy, came off a campus, worked with us, got a PhD, is a wonderful African-American young leader. I had said to her when we first presented, I said, you're going to be a college president one of these days. Well, she may or may not go that route, but she's in a position to really influence things, so it's wonderful to have her voice. So feel free to take those. It's available online or in print. And the other thing, the reason I'm doing this little pitch is that we're always looking for good articles. So as you think about what are we doing that we're most excited about that actually that other people could learn from, think about that not only as a place to get ideas but to give back. So I just wanted to, and speaking of giving back, I don't want to travel back with him. So, so questions.
I'm Lev. I'm the Vice President for Information Technology Services, and one of the things that we in IT for a lot of years, generations, have thought is the more diffusion of technology, the more the probability that we'll actually get to know each other, and in getting to know each other, we'll actually learn to like each other. That's not always the case, and we've learned that in the world of technology. A lot of the things that have in fact led to the sharpest tensions either in a local community, nationally or internationally, are actually precipitated by the broad availability of technology that leads to diffusion but doesn't lead to us loving one another. So one of the things that I think that's quite interesting, but I think problematizes a lot of what we're doing is that we don't often challenge that assumption as it relates to our work in diversity, either in the national or the international context. When we look at things going on in Pakistan, for example, right now, it's the educated classes who are actually, in many ways, up in an uproar and basically melting away whatever liberal concepts of a society there were, basically melting that away by going to group politics. So I just wondered if, so your sort of insights here on something that's anything but binary choices of what is good and what is bad, but the complexity.
I think yes. I mean, I think there's been critiques. One of the good things, I'll speak out of my work in women's studies. One of the intellectual and personal and social things we needed to do was to say what women are we talking about when we talk about women, and in order to do that, we then had to name who we were, and in order to do that, we then named who we were, and in naming that, there was a period in which we said, you can't possibly know anything about me because you're not me. But in fact, little pieces of it just wouldn't finally fit. And of course, part of maybe I should not read Shakespeare. It sort of takes out a whole category of people that you can't actually know or be. So what is it that we do need to do, even if we won't really understand things in the same way? I think in terms of when identity mixes with politics, it does two things. It becomes a leverage for having certain groups actually be able to articulate and get visibility for unmet needs. And we saw that in the civil rights movement. And what we saw with someone like Martin Luther King was the resistance to violence. I look at that and the level of violence against civil rights and the level of violence to maintain white supremacy from slavery, but then in Reconstruction and then during the lynchings that Ida B. Wells Barnett had to work on. I'm astounded that there wasn't more violence in this country, and that there was some way in which he kept focused on something beyond the group. My group wants to be part of the we. Now, so I think we have to know when some group identities are being manipulated for political reasons in order to achieve things. So sometimes when we look at what we think are religious differences, that is more complicated than that. The Hutu and Tutsis, more complicated, though that was what it was built on. So, which groups were taking power and what pieces were doing the slaughtering and why. And so I don't know whether it's not really answering other than to say this is why we need to understand diversity deeply and need to probe and keep asking the questions behind the group identities, because and to determine where there are real places for coalition building, which is what democracy is all about. It presumes there are differences, even though it didn't have too many of those in the beginning, too many of what we would see as differences. Back then, they're worried about too many Presbyterians coming to the Board of Trustees of Harvard, which is run by Congregationalists. So, and Ben Franklin was worried about too many Germans and the German language in Pennsylvania. I mean, so the differences then were of a different chord, but they were still marked. But in our government, our form of government, it's a deliberative democracy. It's not acting like one because there isn't much deliberation, which is why you have, I think, as much concern about the quality of our coming together and talking across difference. It's why Ford Foundation sponsors something called Sustained Dialogues. It's why there's a student group, difficult dialogues, and there's a student group that grows out of a diplomat's history working with the Russians in the Cold War about sustained dialogue, because he knew even if it didn't seem like you're making progress, you could. But it's not easy, and it's not, but I do think with technology, you've raised a really important point. We can't assume that technology will do it all by itself. You have to think about the structured interaction and what will come out of it, and what the content is of it. I mean, one of the reasons that there can be some of the most inflammatory ways to set up all of those senses of where I'm surrounded by racists, or I'm surrounded by anti-Semites, or because it gets such publicity. So, I mean, it really does pose problems about how to handle that.
I've been reading lots of accounts. Well, my name is Joseph Williams. I'm the director of the Office of Multicultural Programs at the School of Medicine, and I've been there for 15 years. And I visit about 30 campuses every year, undergraduate campuses, as a part of our recruiting efforts for various programs in medical school. And I know all the stuff that we read about that talks about the advantages of a more multicultural society and education and all that stuff. And I believe in it to my core. But the fact of the matter is, when I visit campuses or I walk around this campus, there is a certain amount of segregation. In fact, a lot of segregation that on the surface looks like it's based on race and ethnicity, but which may also mask economic stratification. I know that was certainly true when I was an undergraduate. And it makes me just wonder, and I have a daughter who's an undergraduate at Washington University in St. Louis, and I look at her friends and who they are and all that, and I don't really see it. I'm sure that there, somewhere around this campus at some point this academic year, there will be a black child who will, I shouldn't call it a child, a black student in a dormitory will have a midnight conversation with someone of Indian or white origin, and it will be meaningful to the two of them. But it would strike me that if that's the only thing we can really point to or have reason to believe that really occurred then what are we doing here? We're talking about possibilities, of course, and that's what part of what higher education is about. It's about possibilities. But the amount of real stuff seems awfully flimsy to me. And I was wondering if you could address that.
I mean, I mean, why should students here be any different than the communities they've come from that are highly stratified? And at Berkeley, Troy Duster, you might know Troy Duster is because he does some actual medical research, though he was now at, I think, splits positions between NYU and Berkeley. He was part of a group to try and figure out why this was happening at Berkeley. That is the sort of groupings all together. And they seem to have tried everything. People came to Berkeley because it was diverse. They wanted to be there. And they all were uniformly, as students, disappointed that they didn't have the full benefits, because they thought it would be a benefit. But there were patterns of, you'd start radio stations and then there'd be segregated music things, and then you'd start a student club and there'd be segregated, self-chosen. We need to make a distinction between self-chosen groupings and not self-chosen grouping. And one of the things that Troy, there were two things that he discovered that was reinforced what Beverly Tatum said in Why Are the Black Kids All Sitting Together in the Cafeteria. One of the things he discovered when they'd go into the cafeteria and see a group of black students together, a group of Hispanic students or Asian students, was that they were dealing with the incredible diversity within. They were different classes, different sometimes ethnic backgrounds, different geographies, different politics, and that's what they were spending their time talking about. The other thing that introduced me to Sylvia Hurtado, who now runs the Higher Education Research Institute, when she was an emerging scholar at Michigan, was that the most segregated group of any on a college campus are white people, are white students. So that the students of color, not if you think about it 2 seconds, you know, the students of color here are going to have to interact more with white people than white people will with them. They're just, you know, they're just more of us, white people. So that was also interesting to sort of think, well, where are these patterns happening? Why are we always talking about the students of color that segregate instead of the others? So that's another question. What Troy's task force finally decided was that the one place we could create group interaction across differences was in the classroom. And that it put a special burden, not burden, a special opportunity, a special challenge to faculty to create environments in which students didn't get to choose, in which they couldn't, and of course part of teamwork is you can't do it as well if there aren't all of you pitching in. So it's also a positive version of what makes groups work well across differences, is you're all working toward a common end. So that's what they did at Berkeley, and that was one of their key findings, that it was in the curriculum in the classroom where there was real opportunities. I would also argue that some, you know, I'm a faculty member, so I have this bias, that it is also in what the students are reading in those courses. How segregated are the canons? How much is the course itself, whatever the composition of the students sitting there, introducing them to multiple voices, to a variety of people arguing it out with each other, to a variety of people who have surprisingly unusual positions that you wouldn't have guessed them to have. So that's another place, not only in the interaction of the people, but the interaction and the sort of the playbill, if you will, of the course itself, of the information that it's doing. You have so many, I mean, if I think about nursing and engineering in particular, management as well, these are medicine. You can't do that work in isolation. It's pretty hard. Your patients, if not your workers in medicine, for instance, they're going to come from all over. So, you know, part of what nurses are, you know, and all medical care now, you know, are trying to raise the level of multicultural competencies. What they end up seeing, of course, is that there is a certain stratification where most of the people of color are would be in nursing and not at the top level, and not at the top level of the top doctors who are paid the most money, who are, so you keep bumping into these pockets, but you can't do your work well, we can't get the health care that we need and the level of health if we don't sort of fix and address these issues. So, I think there's and for student affairs, I don't want to leave student affairs out, because student affairs is very powerful in its ability to create environments in which the students have opportunities to work across the differences, in which the kind of activities in the dorms are scheduled to create those. And then there's also the important remembrance that for groups that feel that they aren't in the majority of whatever it is, we'll cluster. When I was at LaSalle, one of 9 professors, whenever we'd see each other walking across campus, we would stop and talk. And inevitably, if there were 3 or more of us and a man passed by, they'd say, "What are you women plotting?" We were very hyper-visible, as if somehow we were doing something because we were together and were visible. I'm going somewhere with this. But so when we ended up creating a group of women professionals to meet together, to support each other in a series of things we wanted for our own professional growth and institutionally, et cetera. And I remember an article at Wesleyan that Edgar was pointing out that I think it was the Malcolm X house, I think that's what it was called. It turns out, I think it was in relation to an article about my campus, Duke. It was a headline that said, "Duke, more segregated than ever." And I thought, not in my day. I mean, when I went, it was a segregated institution. It integrated the year after I was a student. So Duke has its history, and that may be one of the ones you visit. Duke has a history, of being really segregated. So when it invites new students, and they are wrestling with that, central campus, and that's where all the African American students, and how do you make sure that students have opportunities? We can manipulate the world that we're in. But the Living Learning Center at Malcolm X, the students who stayed in that, usually, there was a question about whether there should be one. The students who stayed in that had a higher cum, and they never were there more than a year and a half, 2 at the most. And there was a huge amount of flow, because they did lots of programming. They brought lots of people into it. So you have to look behind what looks obvious and see whether you are also encouraging your students, setting opportunities for your students, creating deliberate ones. These sustained dialogues are wonderful kind of things to do, where the students decide what groups they want to, what issue they want to talk about, and they meet with each other every week for a whole semester, sometimes a whole year, working with each other across those differences. So we aren't helpless, even though the gravitational pull will be, often toward what's most comfortable. So, someone else.
Any more questions? Well, I want.
Well, there's one more. Yeah, I'll try and give a shorter answer.
My name's Arthi Piatti. I work in counseling services. I'm a clinical psychologist. And a lot of the work I do, I think of in terms of retention, keep students here. Can you hear? I don't know if you can. Yeah, okay. I wanted to ask a question about students underrepresented students who are first generation to university, who have internalized either prejudice or a belief that they can't succeed. I do work on an individual basis with these students. What can an institution do to encourage empowerment, gender, race, sexual orientation, to feel that they belong here and for themselves to believe they deserve it?
What are some of the things you think that as a collective work, because this is a really critical thing. We aren't oblivious to the worlds around us. That's the power of keeping things in place. We take it inside and we believe what people say about us. It's very hard to get it out. What are you doing in various areas that you have responsibility? Or any of you doing things?
Yeah,
yes.
One of the things I've done that's worked best, and it surprised me when it was on your list, was not aimed at diversity at all. It was simply collective writing assignments, where it wasn't meant to be a diversity exercise, but some of the collectives were diverse, and that has been extremely constructive.
Okay. And what do some of you do that helps your students believe they can succeed if you're a faculty member, or if you're in career counseling, that they can they can have a lot of options before them. What are some of the kind of concrete things?
At the beginning of every school
Yeah,
year, I invite
medicine.
all the minority first-year medical students to my house for dinner. And I always show it's a very good dinner. And I wouldn't remember it, but I also invite 2 or 3 of the fourth-year medical students who are also minority students. And I ask them, and I select the fourth-year students and tell them, I want you to be candid about what the last 3 years have been like for you, and the good and the bad, and so that they'll see these students are like me. Some of them have struggled, some of them may have repeated a year, but there are also some stars, some academic stars, and all clearly very fine people. And I think that gives them the message that you can do it too.
Yeah, I think Blake, I forget his first name, who was a wonderful former provost at IUPI at Iowa State, did Sisters Circle and Brothers, forget what the brothers, but they created these peer, and he linked them to the graduate students, so that that people were surrounded by these positive kind of mentoring, opportunities. So that's of success. Another thing, of course, is the faculty, the faculty administrators and leaders they see every day before them. That is, I can be you.
But they don't see very many.
Exactly, that's part of, that's one of my points. I mean, that's another solution to work. That's a more long-term, deeper institutional one, but that's going to be a piece of the success. More young women think they can be college presidents because there are more college presidents. That has jumped from 3% in my day to about, I think, 25 or 6%. I mean, so you just see it more regularly. You are an example of one, and she'll have a different portrait. I don't know where her portrait will appear in the, but that'll be nice, and then some young student walking through will say, oh, because I can remember when my 3-year-old, we were playing hospital, and I said, why don't you be the doctor? And she said, no, I'll be the nurse. And I said, well, you could be either one. And she said, no, only men are doctors. Girls have to be nurses. And I'm looking up at the pipes in my ceiling, and she didn't watch much TV. I'm thinking, where did she get this from her feminist mother, who had trucks and everything around? And it was probably because I gave her the doctor kit and my mother gave her the nurse kit, and she liked the cap. But somewhere along the way, she got that message. So it's just everywhere. It's in the dust, So how do you create lots of other visuals? And you do it in these wonderful. You do it in the kind of people you bring in. You do it in who you read. You do it in their understanding of what who made change in the world, and lifting up the people who do that. I mean, and you do it by going to a counseling center when you're feeling sort of defeated before you begin, and they have someone like you who can go right to the heart and can help name for them what it is that is really something they're carrying inside that doesn't correlate. It's like skinny people who think they're fat because they might have been a little overweight at some point and they just carry that image in. So it's sort of how do you make them see themselves in their full possibilities?